Welcome everybody to Tips and Tricks for Implementing Civic Action Project in your middle school classroom. Our featured guest, partner, and experienced CAP educator, Chris Spinelli from the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship at the Lou Fry Institute, and also Laura Wesley, Associate Director at Constitutional Rights Foundation. Together, they'll be able to share some tips and tricks for successfully implementing CAP in your classroom or extracurricular environment.
And Chris, if you'd just like to quickly introduce yourself, and we'll jump into the first question.
Sure. I'm happy to be here. My name is Chris Spinelli, and as Gregorio said, I am the Civics Instructional Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship at the Lou Fry Institute at the University of Central Florida.
We're super excited to have you joining us today, especially with all your experience with Civic Action Project in Florida. And so I think that brings me to the first question is, why Civic Action Project? Why are the teachers you're working with, why do they use Civic Action Project?
So like most states, Florida has a series of standards and benchmarks that teachers are required to deliver to their students. And one of our benchmarks requires students to engage in researching a public policy, developing alternatives, figuring out which government agencies would be most appropriate to address the change, and then determine a new course of action. And so as a result of this, we have embedded in our instructional standards a civic action project already. So when you take what the Constitutional Rights Foundation has created for teachers, it just seemed like it was a natural fit. In order for a teacher to be able to deliver this benchmark, they have all of this curriculum ready-made, easily accessible, and sure to go so that they can, deliver that appropriately.
One of the very first questions a lot of teachers ask us is, where do we start? How do students select their issue that they're going to work on for their Civic Action Project?
So one of the first things that our teachers do is when they jump into the lessons, the first lesson is what we call the citizen man, right? And so that helps the teacher begin to develop content knowledge amongst the students as far as what kids as citizens need to know, understand, and be able to do. So what is the skill set that a good citizen develops in order to affect change? Once they've done that, then they move into that next phase. Then, okay, you as a citizen, you live in this world, whether your community is the school, your neighborhood, or, the larger picture, your state, nation, or the world. Surely there's something that is important to you. What is it that you have noticed within your community that if you were the decision maker, what's one of the things that you could fix? What's one of the things that you would select? And based on that, then the students start to brainstorm with one another as far as the class is concerned. And so they throw out a series of ideas that they end up glomming onto. And as a result of that, they then are selecting the issue that is of most important to them. And then once that issue is selected, we know that we have student buy-in, right? Because if it's important to them, they're going to be willing to move forward with the project. And so, when we look at that, it does become important because students have to have that buy-in. Without it, they're not going to be able to move forward. They have to know that what's important to them is important to others. And through that process, they're also able to develop that sense of collaboration, which is so important to be able to advance any type of policy change.
Do you think you could share just a few of the issues that students that either you've worked with or that teachers have worked with, that topics that they have addressed?
Sure. So we have had mental illness, texting while driving. My favorite, though, happened about 2 years ago. We were working with a middle school in Orlando, and one of our students that was involved with the project was wheelchair bound. And one of the things that had always concerned her was lack of handicap accessible playground equipment. Remember, we're talking about middle school students. So we're talking about a student who's 11, 12 years old, and not that long ago was still in elementary school. So whenever she would go to recess with her peers, they were all able to run to the playground equipment, jump on the swings, go down the slide, move their way across the monkey bars. And here she is. She's watching others play while she sits in her wheelchair. And so what she decided to do is make it her project to investigate the number of handicapped accessible playgrounds in Orange County, and then look at all of the elementary schools within the public school system. And what she discovered is that there were only 2 handicapped accessible playgrounds within the whole county, and not one of the elementary schools had handicapped accessible equipment. So she ended up presenting to the Orange County School Board, her findings, and laid out a map to say, here's where I live, and the closest playground for me to be able to access is over an hour away from my home. Here's where I live. This is my school, and there is no playground equipment. And when she did her public service announcement, the opening shot was of her sitting on the sidewalk with all of these kids just running past her. And then, they sort of blur the students, as you can clearly, make out that they're playing on the equipment. And here she is just, sitting in her chair listening to the birds. And so that was one of the most powerful things. Now, was there huge success there? No, but she was able to raise the awareness. And that's an important component, because sometimes they're not going to be successful. And in this instance, it was the cost. I mean, to, include handicapped accessible playground equipment for schools in particular is cost prohibitive. But she was able to make her case, raise the awareness, and the decision makers, the policy makers understood that. And so it was something that they could certainly empathize with. And maybe in the future, for other students like this one, that future of being able to have access to that equipment so that they can play with their peers may happen.
So another question we often get from teachers too is, how do you help students narrow down their issues?
The first question that we have our students ask when they're selecting their project is, what's reasonable? What's something that you can actually accomplish within the context of this greater theme, right? And so when you ask that question of students, they begin to narrow it down further. So they're still sticking within that overarching theme, that you mentioned, Laura, homelessness, or, recycling, environmental cleanup, whatever the case happens to be, but what's reasonable for them to be able to accomplish. And then once they address that reasonableness, then we can hone in on particular aspects of a policy. So, for example, one of the projects that we worked on was the creation of student IDs. We had a group of middle school students who were worried about school safety and were wanting to figure out ways in which they could make their school a safer place. So first thing they do is they identify that their school is going to be their community. And then secondly, when we talk about the importance of school safety, that's such a broad topic area. So it's important for the students to feel safe. So then the question then becomes, well, what is something that's reasonable for you to be able to accomplish within the context of the policies that your local school board has in place regarding school safety? And so one of the things that they decided was, I think it's reasonable for us to be able to advocate that all students have IDs and wear their IDs. And then that way, when anyone's on campus, if you see that ID card, then we know that you are where you're supposed to be, that you're part of the school community, and that you're not from outside. And for them, that was important. So again, they investigated the policy. They knew that IDs were distributed to the students, but that it wasn't a requirement for them to wear them. So now the piece that they advocated for was for students to have to wear them when they were on campus. And so, again, the key decision makers thought, that's reasonable. And so that was something that they could go ahead and attempt to implement. So, buying of lanyards, making sure that students had those, IDs, and, when they were on campus, they were worn. And the other thing to that, and this is an indirect result, it also helps students learn who each other was, right? You go to a school of several hundred kids, depending on the area, maybe even, several thousand kids. But, when you see another student wearing an ID, now you can put a face with a name, because the name is clearly hanging around an ID badge on their neck. And so now you begin to recognize people, remember their names. And so, I say indirectly building, school community. But to the initial question, Laura, it's all about what's reasonable. What can you reasonably hope to accomplish as a result of looking at this policy?
Can you explain a little bit about how the CAP planners help with the process of organizing student civic action projects?
Yeah, the planners are really the key, right? I mean, you know this. What's great about the planner as far as assisting students with how they move forward is it constantly is asking them where they are, where they've been, and where they want to be. And so by looking at those three positions, students are constantly able to say to themselves, okay, here's what I'd like to do. Here's where I need to be. And in order to get there, I need to do this. And so the other piece about the planner is the reflective nature, right? Because we know when we attempt to make change, sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not. And through that reflective piece, students are constantly asking themselves, okay, what has worked, what hasn't? If it's worked, I'm going to continue to do it. But if it hasn't, what tweaks can I make so that it will now work? And I'm going to be able to advance my project even further. So, an example of this would be, I emailed a decision maker. I didn't hear anything back. Maybe now I should make a telephone call with my parents, for example, or maybe I should handwrite a letter. Maybe the handwritten letter will get a response. Maybe I should schedule an appointment and go down to the office. So because of the planner and constantly, looking at the past, the present, and the future, and that reflective nature that's automatically built in as a result of the planners, kids are constantly able to revise their process and really look at the best way of moving forward because they're constantly revisiting, those key pieces of, where we were, where we are, and where we want to be.
Moving on to the next question is engagement, right? So with like any kind of project, it's often maybe hard to keep students engaged. So is there any secrets or tips that you have in order to keep students engaged in the CAP process?
In all honesty, the answer is it has to be relevant for the kid. It's all about the relevance. And that goes back to, the initial question, how do kids choose their topic? And is that they choose it. They have to be the decision makers in this instance, right? And as a result of that and making sure that it stays relevant, that then in and of itself becomes the incentive, right? Because the student has now selected a topic that's important to them. And if it's important to you, you're going to want to see something come as a result of whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And so in all honesty, I mean, even external of any, summative assessment that a teacher may have, whatever the case happens to be, it's this idea of, this is important enough for me to choose. I want to see this through. And it's that driving force, especially when students end up seeing those small successes as a result of what they planned through the planner. And when they when those plans come to fruition, it's like, okay, great, I can check this off. Now what's my next step? So they're wanting to see it through, and here's the thing. I mean, it also highlights that they're important and what they think matters, regardless of their age. And, given the times in which we live, you can't help but be pleased when a student recognizes an issue within a community setting and wants to do something about it because they think there's something that needs to be addressed. And I can't think of a better way of highlighting their interest than looking at it through a CAP lens, because you have identified a relevant piece that needs to be fixed. Because it's relevant to you, you're going to have this incentive to want to see it through. And, even though we have an instructional requirement, it doesn't really feel like it's instruction. Anytime you can get a kid's hands dirty in, democratic content knowledge, that's always going to be a good thing as far as I'm concerned. But the engagement really does come through the relevance. They're able to see the importance of it.
Thanks, Chris. So moving on, another question that we often get from teachers is about assessment. And I know that you work with teachers both inside the classroom and also those teachers are working using CAP as an after-school activity. How does the assessment piece work?
Teachers really approach this project from a formative perspective. You know, you can always have a summative piece in terms of, are students, writing a report appropriately? Are they using, proper grammatical punctuation, whatever the case happens to be. But when it comes to CAP, there's really no right or wrong, and the teachers recognize that. And so, when they're assessing, students, they're really looking at it from a formative perspective in that, how have I seen a development of deliberation amongst my students? How have I seen, a collaborative spirit begin to emerge amongst my students? What type of democratic community is now emerging as a result of this project? How are they working together to be able to accomplish their goals, right? And so, when the project comes to a culmination, teachers are really able to make those evaluations because, they're doing a public presentation, right? And so the teacher's able to then sit back and say, okay, I can see how, Sally did X because the information she shared was based in research. She was familiar with her policy. She was able to, advocate a change in position. And you're not going to be able to do that unless you've done the necessary research, unless you've taken the necessary steps to be able to accomplish those goals. So in all honesty, if a teacher just looks at those planners and they're able to see each of the steps that the students has taken, then there's no reason to think that they haven't done what needs to be done as far as the project is concerned. I think that's the challenge, here is that because sometimes the students aren't going to be successful with what they're advocating. It doesn't mean that the project has failed, right? Because, it really is about the development of those skills. And the only way you can develop those skills is to be able to practice them. And that's what this project does. So that's why I say, we found the greatest success when teachers are formatively assessing their kids. They can evaluate their students based on, at the beginning of the term, here's where they were, and now I'm seeing this. And it's a legitimate outcome because you see it through the presentation. You see the deliberation, the collaboration, and that development of a community spirit, because we're all in this together. We want to advance this policy. And so the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we come across as having a united voice. And that comes through as a result of the steps that they take throughout the project.
Speaking about presentation, right? I know you all do a showcase. Can you explain a little bit about what that looks like, what
Sure.
the role the students play in that?
When we do our showcase, we invite all of the students to the University of Central Florida, and the university hosts them. And then based on the project topic, we then reach out to those policy decision makers, right? So that we have those key players in the room as the students deliver their projects. And then through that, they are highlighting the policies that they're examining, as well as the alternatives to that policy. Then they're able to engage in a question and answer session with those decision makers. And we've had projects where they have been successful and things have changed. And we've had others where it wasn't that we aren't hearing you, it's that it's cost prohibitive, or there was something that might be a bit more pressing that required the attention, or whatever the case happens to be. But the students do a professional presentation. They put together typically a PowerPoint, and then the students basically tag team what they're going to share and what they're going to present, so that, from the first student who speaks to the last student who speaks, you can see the progression of the project. You can see the culmination move as a result of their policy advocacy. And they don't take on, easy subjects. I mean, this last go around, we actually had students that were interested in human trafficking, a heady issue, but Florida was passing laws. A group of students were concerned, and they were, beginning to, examine examine that. And, from that perspective, if you've got students who are willing to look at that and then share that with the key decision makers, that just goes to show that, we are truly developing a skill set that they're going to be able to carry with them for the rest of their days. But that's what we hope to get out of the expo. We don't make it so that it's intimidating in any way. We make it, as relaxed an atmosphere as possible, so that it truly does become a conversation between them and the policymakers. And for the last several showcases, they've gone quite successfully. The students have felt when they left that they were accomplished, that their voices were heard.
Finally, we can't end this conversation without really talking about the impacts. If you could just maybe share a little bit about what the impact has been on your students who participate in the CAP program.
The number one thing that our students say is that they've learned that they can make a difference, right? I think it was President Kennedy who said, every person can make a difference and everyone should try. And I'm sure I just butchered that, but the bottom line is, when you set your mind to it, if it's that important to you, then you're going to be able to see it through. And even at such a young age, knowing that if there's something of importance to you that you want to see changed, you can absolutely go ahead and do that. But more importantly, CAP gives students the skill set to be able to feel that way when all is said and done. And so you're not born with knowing how to be an effective citizen. It's something that you have to learn how to do, and you have to develop that skill set. And I think the greatest impact is that students do learn that skill set. They learn how to be deliberative, and I've said it before, but how to be collaborative, and then really develop that sense of community, because you're not the only one who's concerned about whatever the policy issue is. There are others like you. Now, are you going to always agree on the approach? No, but that's where that idea of deliberation comes from, right? We're going to be able to examine each other and say, okay, you think this, I think this, but now here's the collaborative piece. We've got some middle ground, right? We can work around these pieces, and through those two steps, you're developing that sense of community. I can't think of anything else that's going to provide a greater impact, because it doesn't matter how much content knowledge you give to a kid, if they can't put it into action, it's not going to do them any good. And that's my view, right? I mean, it's not going to do them any good. And so the experiences that are created as a result of students engaging in this project last a lifetime. We've heard from students who participated in middle school and have made it their mission to continue doing the same kind of work once they hit high school, whether it be, looking at it through a service club lens, for example, or just continuing, what they feel needs to be the necessary next steps for their advocacy. But the bottom line is, it's not one and done. It's something that sticks with them and they continue. And the other thing is the mentorship that develops as a result of it, because they know that the students that are following them are engaging in this project as well. And because it was so impactful for them, they actually come back and assist the teacher and help the students, because they've learned, and to make sure that those same mistakes don't take place, they help the kids begin to craft that. And so it really is wonderful to see, because I don't think most adults have that ability, and the fact that we're seeing this be developed in middle school students and something that they can take with them really is overwhelming, but so impactful.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you spending some time with us here
My
today
pleasure.
and hearing a little bit about your CAP middle school experience.